Anyway, I'm going to go all the way back to the best part of about 1,000 years. A man called Somerled. Somerled he called himself the Lord of the Isles. Not a title given by a king. Usually the king's the only one that can give a title such as that, but Somerled called it himself. Now, a Spaniard came to Scotland at that point, and when he went back to Spain, he was asked, what was the most impressive thing you saw in Scotland? He says, actually, it wasn't a thing, it was a man. He says, I met a man in Edinburgh who, although he didn't have 2 pennies to rub together, he was a pauper, he had a ripped cloak on, he commanded an army that even the king himself would not dare take on. He's talking about Somerled, the Lord of the Isles. Now, Somerled's father was a Viking nobleman, and his mother was an Irish nobleman. That made him a Gaul-Gael. Now, the only place that you find Gaul-Gaels anywhere in the world, the islands between Ireland and Scotland, that's where you find the Gaul-Gaels. Now, Gaul means stranger, Gael means Gallic, so it's the Gallic stranger. Remember, his mother was a Gallic woman, his father was a Nordic man. The Gallic strangers. Anyway, Somerled went on, his children went on to become Clan MacDonald, Clan MacDougall, amongst others. Now remember what I said earlier on, the king forced the tribes to break up and break into family units. So this is about this time. I'll go into this a wee bit more later on. So Somerled's children became what you call the progenitor of these clans, of these families. Now, the Lords of the Isles, they had a different way of thinking. They believed in what we call tanistry. We today live in a feudalistic society, so our kings, our rulers, are hereditary. So when Charles dies, it'll automatically be William that takes over, for example, okay? The Lords of the Isles, the tanistic rulers, they believed in something completely different. A king would be elected. If the king was no good at the job, would get rid of him. He'd be brutally murdered. There's a lot of evidence of that, especially in Ireland. If you've ever heard of the Irish bog mummies, they believe that these might be failed kings. Anyway, the duties of the king was to make sure that everybody was fed and housed and had the best care that possibly could be given at the time. That's health and social security. What we call health and social security today, here it is 1,000 years ago in Scotland. It was the king's duty to make sure that all of these things were done and done properly. If he couldn't do his job properly, they would get rid of him. If he fought too many battles and lost them, they would get rid of him and just get another one. That's how they done it. Only the strongest and fittest person could be king. That's why it was brutal, such a brutal killing. Anybody that wasn't up to the job would not apply for the job, for fear that they would suffer that terrible fate. Now, throughout that early period of history, the Lords of the Isle became seriously strong. Now, they had their castle, Finlaggan Castle, was on the island of Islay. There's a lot of distilleries there. If you're into your whiskey, you'll know what Islay is. Islay is, now let me try and put this geographically in the mid-air. You've got Edinburgh, you've got Glasgow, and you've got the Firth of Clyde, so that's the waterway that leaves Glasgow and goes down towards the south. So you've got the entire peninsula at the far side of it. So you come out of the Firth of Clyde from Glasgow, round the entire peninsula and come up, and there's Islay there, like that. Okay, now the waters on that side of the country still to this day are some of the most treacherous waters you will find anywhere in the world. The water comes from America straight across the Atlantic, and there's nothing to hinder it until it gets to the west coast of Scotland, where all of these islands, there's 790 islands altogether in the Scottish archipelago, and when it reaches these islands it picks up speed, ferocity and momentum. And in fact, the third biggest whirlpool maelstrom in the world is actually, we're not that far away from it, maybe 100 or so miles away from it, just to the north of Islay. The waters out there were treacherous, and in Somerled's time it was near impossible getting a ship out there unless you were, the best of ships, the best of mariners would make it, but don't try and take a fleet round there. The castle they held on Islay, Finlagan Castle, was just a house. It didn't need defences. Getting to Islay, that was the defences that they had. So they were strong, and they were surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of, what would become the Clan MacDonald, hundreds of them. An army capable of fending off themselves from the king. But the king didn't really have a fleet that could get round there anyway. So the Lords of the Isles, they lived in their own kingdom, they done their own thing, regardless of what the king said. Now, eventually, it came to a period in Scotland that we call the Scottish Wars of Independence. Our king, Alexander III, he died. He rode his horse mistakenly, of course, off a cliff, and he died. The next heir to the throne was his 2-year-old granddaughter, Margaret of Norway. She was the daughter of Alexander's daughter and the King of Norway. But she was called for when she was 7 years old. She crossed the North Sea in a Viking longboat. She died of exposure. These Viking longboats, they're open to the elements. We girl just didn't make it. It left Scotland without a ruler. All the Scots noble families started to fight each other to see who was going to be the next king. They eventually decided that they needed to find themselves an arbitrator, and they chose King Edward I of England. Now, Edward was actually Alexander's brother-in-law from his first marriage. Alexander and Edward had actually gotten on very, very well. So if you know your Braveheart movie and what have you, you know that ruthless English king. Alexander and him were best of friends. In fact, it was the most peaceful period of history between Scotland and England at that point. Anyway, where was I? So, the Scottish Wars of Independence, they began back there at Stirling and they ended back there at Stirling. Now, about halfway through, the actual fighting stopped and it became a war of words to try and come to a conclusion for what was going on. And it was our King Robert the Bruce who was the one who was done the fighting and done the talking. Now, the Lords of the Isles did not like Robert the Bruce. He was a feudalistic king. He was not voted in with their consent, so they chose not to fight for him. And when Edward found this out, his advisor said to him, what to do is give them treasure, give them lots of treasure, but don't divide it amongst them. Just give them the treasure and let them fight it out amongst themselves. That'll keep them occupied. And it worked absolutely perfectly. They were far too busy with each other to be bothered with Robert the Bruce. Anyway, it reached that point where the fighting stopped. Actually, what happened was Edward I died, and it was his son Edward II took over. Now, Edward I was a brilliant military strategist, but his son Edward II, he was nothing like that at all. In fact, Edward stopped the war and basically says, come on lads, said to the army, come on lads, let's just go home, I've had enough of this. And that's what they done. Now, Bruce had made a lot of enemies in Scotland as well, people who had supported Edward rather than himself. With Robert the Bruce, it was very simple. You support me, you take a knee, you're against me, you'll feel my sword. It was that simple with Robert the Bruce. Now, he had dealt with all of the other groups who hadn't supported him, and it now came to the Lords of the Isles. I'm going to jump back a little bit. I'm going to jump back about 100, 200 years at this point. Now, our King Edgar and King Haakon of Norway, they were dividing up Scotland. The Vikings had taken over large parts of Scotland at this point, and this was a negotiation. I believe it was the Treaty of Perth, maybe. Anyway, they were dividing up Scotland, who gets what, and it was agreed that anything that Haakon could sail a ship round belonged to him, and the rest belonged to Edgar. So Haakon went out with his fleet and began to sail round all the islands of Scotland. But when he got to that, remember that Kintyre Peninsula, when you come out of the Firth of Clyde? He wanted that. There's good land there. So what he'd done was he had his men drag his ship over the isthmus while he was standing at the prow of the ship. And he claimed Kintyre for himself, and he got it. He got away with it. So back to Robert the Bruce. Now, Robert the Bruce wanted to deal with these Lords of the Isles, knowing full well that they were masters, experts at sailing, and he didn't really have much of a chance against them in that respect, but that was the only way that he could actually take them on, was in a naval battle. But Robert the Bruce remembered that after that event that had happened with King Haakon and King Edward, a legend had grown up in that area. If ever ships were to appear to the north of Islay that had not previously been to the south, the area would fall. Now it makes perfect sense. The only way that you can get a fleet of ships to Islay, really, unless you went all the way around the north of Scotland, which is even more treacherous than the west, you would have to come out of the Firth of Clyde and then head north towards Islay. The winds, the prevailing winds, were northerly then. That means they're coming from the north. And when you turn your ship into the wind, your ship's pretty useless. You do what's called tacking, but that's all you can do. You don't actually have very much control over your ship. Whereas the ships that have got the wind in their sails, they can manoeuvre in all sorts of ways and direction. They can go very fast, they can drop their sail, go very slow, they can do whatever they want. They had mastery, they had control. Now, what Robert the Bruce done was he went back to that old legend of the Vikings, and he had his men drag all of his ships over the neck of the Kintyre Peninsula. It's only about a kilometre and it's mostly flat, it's not very far. They cut down trees, used them as rollers, dragged the ships over the peninsula. When Robert the Bruce was ready, he launched all of his ships into the, well, it's the Sound of Jura it's called. Now the Lords of the Isles, they were ready with their fleet. They knew that Robert the Bruce was coming for them, but they were facing south. They were waiting for the fleet, the royal fleet coming out of the Firth of Clyde. That never happened. All of a sudden they realised that the enemy were directly behind them. They tried turning their ships round, but it was no good. They were now against the wind. The wind was in the sails of the royal fleet. The battle lasted about half an hour, 45 minutes. There weren't too many casualties, but very quickly the Lords of the Isles, they knew that they were beaten. They took a knee before Robert the Bruce. Look at that, isn't that lovely? This is Glendochart we're coming down into now. He took a knee before Robert the Bruce. Angus Og MacDonald, now that's his name, Angus Og means young, so it's young Angus MacDonald. He became one of Robert the Bruce's most powerful supporters. Remember, he commanded an army that was as strong as the king's own army. All the Highlanders, the Western Islanders and the Highlanders all supported Angus Og MacDonald of Islay. Now throughout the Wars of Independence, John MacDonald was one of Robert the Bruce's strongest supporters, and for that he got more and more land and rewards for fighting and winning battles and things like that. He grew from strength to strength to strength, and in fact there's a lot of sort of paintings, stained glass windows, illustrations of Angus and Robert the Bruce together. Now, eventually by 1329 the Wars of Independence were over. They had been declared over by the Pope. At the end of the day, the Pope had declared that Scotland was a free and independent country and it was not under the control of England. That's what Edward was trying to accomplish. He failed it. Scotland was seen as a sovereign nation. We're actually still a sovereign nation to this day. We have our own money, we have our own law systems, education systems. We're actually, from that time, still a sovereign country to this day, even although we're ruled by Westminster. Anyway, so Robert the Bruce died almost immediately at the end of that. He had a very long, hard life, and you know how these things happen. His body gave up the goods right once it was, everything was dealt with. Angus Og went back to Islay. He done his thing there. Now, Robert the Bruce's son, David II, he had a very troublesome upbringing, youth. There was always somebody trying to steal his throne from him while he was in his minority, and eventually by the time he reached his majority, he wasn't a chip off the old block. He was like Edward I and Edward II. David II wasn't anything like his father, Robert the Bruce. And when he went to Angus Og in Islay, he said to him, "You'll give homage to me." And of course Angus looked at him in the face, and this is over a meeting table of course, looked at him in the face and he laughed at him. He says, "The best you're going to get from me is peace, and you will be happy of it. You're not my king. I don't support you. You're a weak, feeble man. You're not what I would call kingly material. Sorry, goodbye." David was absolutely livid at this, but there wasn't much that he could do about it. Islay was still pretty well impregnable, just simply because of getting a fleet to Islay was the trouble, was a real problem, and he was never going to fall for that trick again, dragging the ships over the isthmus. That would never fall for that one again. Instead, what King David said, he said to his advisors, these wildcats, they are always fighting amongst themselves, and when they do, they always look to the highest arbitrator to solve their problems. He says, well, that's me. I'm their highest arbitrator. When they come to me for advice, I'm going to give them bad advice, and that's exactly what he started doing. And it wasn't just him, it was his successors that also kept on that policy. They were so strong, the Lords of the Isles, they'd done anything they could to weaken their resolve. That was the intent. Now, from this is that point where the clans formed, when we broke out of being tribal units, because the king was putting everybody against each other, and broke down into family units. Family units are much stronger, bonded much stronger when the king was trying to put them against each other. That's that key factor in Scottish history. Anyway, as the kings grew in power, the MacDonalds began to go down in power. They lost lands. There was another family at the same time who, they'd been in the sort of background, they'd fought very hard for Robert the Bruce, but they, instead of fighting David, they had supported David. And when lands were getting taken off the MacDonalds, the Lords of the Isles, they were being given to this clan. This clan was the Clan Campbell, and it's the Clan Campbell lands that we're going to now. Slowly but surely, the Campbells raised up in power. They were marrying into the right circles. They were getting land in the right places. They were becoming more and more powerful. And because of this, the MacDonalds and the Campbells became absolutely hated enemies. Still to this day, it is not advisable to put a Campbell and a MacDonald in a room together and lock the door, because only one of them is going to come out. That's still to this day. I may be exaggerating, but I may not actually be exaggerating. That's the truth of the matter. Anyway, depends who they are. Anyway, slowly but surely, the Campbells were going up in power and the MacDonalds were going down in power. Now, eventually it came to the rule of Edward III of England. Now, he had his desires on France, but he knew that the Scots and the French had a very special relationship together. During those wars of independence, right at the very beginning of the wars of independence, when Edward I started imposing his rule on Scotland, the Scots sent a secret envoy to the King of France, and they made a pact. They call it the Auld Alliance, A-U-L-D, Auld Alliance. And in this pact, it was nice and simple. If ever England attacked France, Scotland would attack England. If ever England attacked Scotland, France would attack England. That's how it was done. And that, even when that was ripped up, the paperwork with the declaration on it was ripped up, that never ever faltered. Scotland and France always had a very, very special relationship with each other. Never ever drew swords against each other. Anyway, so what Edward III wanted to do was not have the Scots attacking him from the rear when he went over to France. So what he'd done was he found the then Lord of the Isles was a man called John of Islay. And he went to John. Now, John was in Ardtornish Castle. Ardtornish Castle it's a remote castle, way out in the rugged west coast of Scotland. The only place really to get there is by ship. Edward sailed his fleet round, came to Ardtornish Castle, and he had a meeting with John. They called it the Westminster Ardtornish Treaty, in which, now, by word, it sounded like John was going to come out very well from this. Edward said to him, you'll get everything north of Edinburgh, Stirling, everything north of that will belong to you. I just want to stop the Scottish king from attacking me from the rear, that's all. But on paper, John of Islay didn't actually get anything at all out of this. John was illiterate, he couldn't read, he didn't realise that he was just being duped into this. Now, Edward then turned his attentions to France. John is waiting for word from Edward when he attacks, so he was going to attack the Scottish king, and John of Islay was also to attack the Scottish king, but that never happened. Edward turned his attentions to France, but he then went to the Scottish King James. Now, this is king to king, talking one-to-one to each other. Edward says to King James, you know that Lord of the Isles person, you know that he's committed treason against you. You know that he signed a treaty with me. If I attack you, he was going to attack you from the rear. And of course King James says, oh, is that right? Thank you for the information. He put out word to capture John of Islay and bring him to him. He wanted to see him in person. Now, John of Islay, as I've already said, he was a skint man. He didn't have any money. They worked more on barter over there. They didn't really use money in the same way we do. But he was a very proud man. Now, he would not run and hide in the hills and spend his life in the hills. Not what he was about. Nobody would be his friend either and support him, which is an unusual thing in the Highlands. By this time, by the rule of King James, ships were bigger, they were more seaworthy, they were capable of getting to Islay and taking Islay. So, in that respect, John's power had seriously weakened. John decided there was only one thing for it. He went to Edinburgh and he laid himself prostrate before the king. The king stripped him of all his arms and laid him in nothing but his shirt on the floor before him in Westminster. And at that he had him thrown into the dungeons at Holyrood Palace. John expected to die a traitor's death. What else would you expect? But instead the king was unbelievably lenient with him. He stripped him of all of his titles apart from that one title that John's ancestor Somerled had given him to himself, the Lord of the Isles. And after a few months he released him. John could not believe his luck. He's heading back over to Islay. He's lost all of his lands, but he still has his life. Now, John had a son. His son was Angus Og, young Angus. And when John got back to Islay, and everybody realised that John had lost all of his power. Remember, under the laws of Tanistry, you have to be strong to remain in charge. Well, John had now proven himself not to be as strong as he originally was. All of John's support automatically went to his son, Angus Og. So now Angus Og was the powerful one, not his father, John. When they discovered that all the lands to the north of Scotland, Ross and Cromarty and places like that, had been given away by the king, they went up there and attacked them. Now, the king had put new lords in charge of all of these lands. They went up there and they fire and sword, killed everyone, destroyed everything that had previously been there. This was Angus Og's legacy as far as he saw it. Now, when the king found out, he was absolutely livid. He summoned John of Islay to come before him in Holyrood. You have been nothing but a thorn in my side. You deserve to be dead. You will sort this problem out, or I will deal with you. It's that simple. Now get out of my sight. But the king wasn't finished there. There was somebody else that he wanted to speak to on the same matter. Young Angus Og, just so happened to be married to the daughter of the chief of the clan Campbell. I've forgotten his name, it'll come back to me just now anyway. Archibald Campbell. Now, these two clans were always fighting each other. They tried to calm things down a bit by marrying off their children, the chief's children. Now, the king summoned Archibald as well, and you as well. You're just as bad as John. Between the two of you, you're nothing but a problem to me. If you both do not sort out this problem, I will sort both of you out. It's that simple. Now get out of my sight. Two men who absolutely hated each other with a vengeance now had to face each other over a table and decide what they were going to do. Well, the very obvious end result: war. They had to declare war on young Angus. Now remember, at this point, Angus now has the support of all the Highlanders. I'm going to interrupt myself for another wee second here. Look out on the right hand side and you will see Loch Docker Castle. I believe that castle was taken by Robert Bruce. Anyway, see it there on the island, the ruin of Loch Docker Castle. Anyway, the two men decided war was the only thing. They declared war on young Angus. Now, This is the first date that I'm going to give you. It was circa 1495, round about the year 1495 that this happened. This is actually a true story that I'm giving you. This story took me a very long time to put together. You will not find it written in any book anywhere, and I had to find it element by element by element to put all of this together. Anyway, the sea battle was known as the Battle of Bloody Bay. It's still to this day the greatest naval engagement in British waters, by which I mean there's probably 200 or 300 ships involved in this. There's not been another engagement in the British waters of so many ships. Young Angus took the day. Not only did he defeat his father, he defeated his father-in-law. His father-in-law's sons were all killed in the battle, which meant his father-in-law had no son and heir to the chiefship of the Clan Campbell, which left Archibald Campbell in a very sticky situation. His daughter was pregnant to Angus Og MacDonald. If the child was a man, that child would automatically be the chief of the clan, the new chief of the Clan Campbell when Archibald died. That could not happen under any circumstances whatsoever. You could not have a MacDonald sitting on the throne of the Clan Campbell. That had to be put to an end. Archibald, in a knee-jerk reaction, he kidnapped his daughter. He stole her away and took her to an island fortress called Inchconnell Castle. It is still it's still difficult to get to this day. It's a long, long way down a very long, dark and twisty road to get to, still to this day. Anyway, he locked his pregnant daughter into the dungeon, well, into the castle. I don't know if it was the dungeon. The castle was on an island. He locked her into the castle and left her there, and she was lost, forgotten about. Now, as time went on, she gave birth, and it was a boy, and she named the boy Donald Dubh, Black Donald, and he very quickly took over as Lord of the Isles from his father, Angus Og MacDonald. Now, the boy, he was one of the most powerful people in Scotland, and for that, it was important that he was kept away from his power sources, from his people, as it were. He spent the first 17 years of his life incarcerated in Inchconnell Castle. Now, we're moving forward now, and we're into the reign of Henry VIII. Henry wants to take Scotland, and he has an advisor, a spy, a Scottish spy, a man called Lord Lennox. And he said to Lennox, so if I was to attack Scotland, what would you advise me to do? Lennox turned round to Henry and said to him, Your Majesty, there is a man that I know of who has spent his entire life incarcerated in a castle on the west coast of Scotland. If you were to free this man and get his support, you would command half the Highlanders. They would fight for you under him. My advice to you is to free that man, Donald Dubh. Edward put the wheels in motion. Lord Lennox made a covert operation, as we call it today. They put boats into Loch Awe. They padded the oars with sheep fur, sheep wool, and they waited till the darkest point of the night and slowly paddled out towards Inchconnell Castle. Now, the people at Inchconnell, the castle was self-sufficient. They would go out and catch food and game, whatever they want. They could get vegetables, nuts, berries from the surrounding forests, and they had a very deep well in the castle. They didn't need any outside help whatsoever, and in fact it had probably been months since they saw any outsiders at this point, so the security at the castle would have been really quite lax. Lennox and his men got onto the island, they got into the castle and very quickly overpowered the guards. Now, while the fracas is going on outside, Donald Dubh is very aware of what is going on outside, and he knows that these people are here for him. When finally they take the castle and they find the room where Donald Dubh is being kept, when they open the door, the first words that are said to have come out of Donald Dubh's mouth, now remember, this is one of the most powerfulest people in Scotland. This man's a true through and through Scottish Highlander, a true patriot, if you want. The first words to come out of his mouth I hate all Scotsmen, my enemies. He'd almost gone insane being locked up in that castle. Really had affected him badly. Lennox came in and explained the situation to him. He ended it by saying, what I want you to do, I want you to go over to Ireland. You wait for me there. When I come over with word from Henry to attack, we'll assemble an army, we'll have a pre-assembled army, and we will attack the Scottish king from the north when Edward attacks him from the south. That's what we're to do. Donald Dubh agreed to that. Off he went to Ireland. Now, when he got to Ireland, he was recognised. Who would have thought that he wouldn't have been recognised? One of the most powerful people in Scotland. The Scots and the Irish also had a very special relationship between each other. And it was asked if so word was sent to the Scottish court that Donald Dubh, the Lord of the Isles, is here in Ireland, and by the looks of things he's trying to assemble an army to attack Scotland. The Scots asked, would you extradite him? And they did. They arrested him and extradited him. Lennox hadn't turned up at this point, so Donald Dubh didn't have the support that he needed. He was taken before the King James, in Edinburgh, and laid prostrate on the ground before him. Donald Dubh expected to suffer a traitor's death. Well, who wouldn't? Instead, the king again was very, very lenient with him. He threw him into the dungeons of Holyrood, and then eventually decided that he was to be moved to Tantallon Castle. Tantallon Castle is about 30 miles round the coast from Edinburgh. He was incarcerated in the dungeon there, and he spent the rest of his life in the dungeons of Tantallon Castle. Now, for a man who never actually done anything, just simply held the power almost equal to the king, he spent for that his entire life, barring those few short months that he was in Ireland. He spent his entire life in castle dungeons just simply because who he was.